Summer, 1940. The English Channel glittered like a blade beneath the sun, a narrow silver barrier between two worlds at war. From the airfields of northern France, the Luftwaffe rose each morning, the hum of their engines rolling across the water like distant thunder. To the German pilots, the sky over England was a prize already promised. They had conquered the air in Poland, in France, in Belgium. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was their sword and shield, faster, higher climbing, a machine that seemed untouchable. At dawn, Oberleutnant Karl Keller stood by the wing of his fighter, the yellow nose gleaming with condensation. Ground crews moved like ghosts around him, loading ammunition, checking pressure lines. He adjusted his gloves, glanced at the horizon where the sea faded into mist, and felt the familiar pull in his chest. Not fear, but expectation. Today, he told his wingman, we end this island's arrogance. His voice was calm, almost weary. For weeks they had hunted the RAF and always returned with stories of speed. The English could turn, yes, but speed decided battles, or so they believed. Across the channel, in a field of wind-bent grass near Biggin Hill, Sergeant Alan Briggs tightened his parachute harness and looked toward the east. The warning bell had not yet sounded, but he could feel it coming. The air smelled of oil, cut grass, and the faint sweetness of summer. Around him, the mechanics joked in low voices, their laughter thin and nervous. The Spitfire behind him shimmered in the early light, elegant, almost delicate, its elliptical wings promising grace over brute force. They'll come fast, his squadron leader had said during briefing. But remember, speed runs out, turning never does. At 09:07, the alarm wailed. Within minutes, the Spitfires were clawing into the sky, the Merlin engine screaming as they spiraled upward into the thin blue. Radio chatter filled their ears, clipped, mechanical. Enemy formation, 20 plus, crossing the coast, altitude 20,000. Keller's group sighted them first, small dots, climbing hard into the sun. Englische Jäger ahead, he called. He pushed the throttle forward, the DB601 engine roaring in response. His Messerschmitt leapt like a hound off its leash. The others followed, diving from height, with the wind shrieking against their canopies. Briggs saw them at last, black crosses glittering against the light, descending fast. Instinct spoke before training. He rolled left, then climbed, keeping the sun behind his tail. The Spitfire responded instantly, its wings biting the air. The first German burst passed just beneath his fuselage, tracers streaking orange through the haze. Too fast, Briggs muttered. The Messerschmitt flashed by, overshooting, its momentum carrying it out of the fight it had started. Briggs pulled into a climbing turn, tightening the circle, his vision narrowing as blood drained from his eyes. The G-force crushed him into the seat, but the Spitfire held steady, turning tighter, sharper, waiting for the moment when speed became weakness. Keller cursed under his breath, rolled to pursue, but the Spitfire was already inside his arc. The German's advantage of velocity now worked against him. He tried to climb away, yet the Englishman stayed glued to his tail. In his headset, voices barked, Achtung! Brake right! Brake right! He banked, dove, climbed again, each maneuver slicing the sky into white scars of contrail. But every escape bled speed, and every turn drew him deeper into the trap. From the cliffs below, fishermen and soldiers watched the dance, tiny flashes of light looping and diving, contrails twisting into spirals like handwriting across the clouds. To them it looked graceful, almost beautiful. Up there, it was chaos. Vibration, gunfire, sweat, the metallic taste of oxygen from the mask. Briggs squeezed the trigger once. The Spitfire's guns chattered, and a thin line of smoke trailed from the Messerschmitt's wing. Keller yanked his stick hard, too hard, the aircraft shuddering as lift vanished. He recovered just above the sea, engine coughing, pride wounded deeper than the metal. He turned south, limping toward France, while the Spitfire climbed back into the fight. By noon, the sky over Dover was a web of white vapor, the air heavy with the smell of oil and burned powder. 2 British fighters had gone down, swallowed by the channel. 4 Messerschmitts failed to return to their bases. The Luftwaffe reports that evening mentioned unexpected losses during turning engagements. The phrase would appear again and again in the months to come. Briggs landed at Biggin Hill with trembling hands. His machine was riddled with holes, but still alive. Mechanics swarmed over it like medics around a wounded man. He pulled off his helmet and laughed, not out of joy, but disbelief. They had survived the first real test, and somewhere above the smoke and sunlight, a new truth had begun to form. Speed alone was not enough. That night, in a wooden hut near the runway, he opened his logbook and wrote a single line. The Messerschmitts are fast, but they cannot dance. Across the channel, in a barracks near Calais, Keller did the same. His words were fewer, colder. Do not turn with Spitfires. The battle for Britain had truly begun. The sky itself had chosen sides, and the lesson of that first day would echo in every dogfight that followed. Power wins the climb, but agility wins the war. The next weeks turned the skies over southern England into a classroom written in fire and vapor. Each morning, the same ritual repeated. The echo of sirens, the scramble bell, engines howling as pilots raced to their aircraft. And every evening, the same exhausted faces returned, streaked with oil and sweat, haunted by the knowledge that tomorrow would ask for more. At first, the Luftwaffe believed the pattern would break in their favor. The Bf-109s were faster, their dives steeper, their climb unmatched. But day after day, the same odd detail emerged from after-action reports. The Messerschmitts lost momentum in turning fights. The English fighters, smaller, slower in straight flight, somehow managed to twist the air itself into an advantage. At Biggin Hill, the British squadron studied the pattern with growing fascination. In the map room, chalk lines marked enemy routes, arcs of attack, points where Spitfires met the Germans head-on. The men spoke quietly, leaning over the maps as if over an operating table. They're quicker in the dive, said Squadron Leader Parker, tapping the board with a ruler. But once you get them to turn, they fall apart. Their prop pitch drops, their engine over-revs. They can't hold it. Alan Briggs sat nearby, still aching from yesterday's flight. His hands trembled slightly, the aftertaste of adrenaline, but his eyes were sharp. They think they can climb out of trouble, he said. But once they start circling, they're ours. The lesson spread through the RAF like whispered scripture. Don't chase, turn. Draw them in, make them commit to a curve, and the speed advantage dies in seconds. For the Germans, the opposite doctrine had long been gospel. Speed is life was written into the bones of their training. The Bf-109 was designed for vertical fighting, hit, climb, and dive again. But England's skies, with their thick clouds and unpredictable winds, turned that purity of design into a trap. In August, the Luftwaffe changed its approach. Larger formations crossed the channel, tight groups of bombers shielded by Messerschmitts flying in the famous Rote and Schwarm formations. Keller now led 4 fighters at a time, tasked with keeping the bombers alive long enough to release their payloads. It was a burden he resented. The bombers were slow, cumbersome, dragging the sleek fighters into fights they could no longer choose. One morning, his flight intercepted a group of Hurricanes over Canterbury. The sky was pale, almost white, the sun a flat disk in the haze. Keller's wingman shouted, Achtung! Spitfires! Low! Left! Keller cursed. The British had come from below, using the sun and the clouds to blind the escorts. It was a trick the Luftwaffe itself had taught Europe in earlier wars. Now, the lesson had come home. The Spitfires climbed in a slow spiral, forcing the Germans to turn if they wanted to engage. Keller pushed the throttle forward. The nose dipped. The DB-601 engine roared. He dived, fired, then pulled up sharply, too sharply. The wings trembled. The aircraft lost speed. In his mirror, he saw a flash of green and brown. The Spitfire had cut inside him, rising effortlessly into position. The next burst of tracers crossed his canopy, bright and clean like sparks on glass. He escaped, but barely. When he landed at Calais, the mechanics found holes in the fuselage, the smell of burnt paint sharp in the air. Keller removed his gloves and stared at his hands, steady, but cold. They turn tighter, he told his commanding officer. It's not just the plane, it's the pilot. Across the channel, the British celebrated small victories. They still lost men every day, too many. But the numbers began to tilt. In the mess hall, laughter returned, brittle but real. The Spitfire pilots were learning that their greatest weapon wasn't their guns or engines, but the shape of their wings. The elliptical design, first mocked by some engineers as impractical, now proved its genius. The Spitfire could roll smoothly at high speed and maintain lift through steep turns without stalling. In tight dogfights, it carved perfect circles through the air, where the Messerschmitt struggled and slipped. Engineers at Supermarine examined combat footage, frame by frame. They noticed that during sustained turns, the Bf-109's slats, small panels on the wing edges meant to improve stability, snapped open suddenly, creating drag and disrupting aim. Pilots described it as a wobble, a split-second hesitation that gave the Spitfire an opening. At the Air Ministry, Analysts compiled these observations into reports marked confidential. Tactical exploitation of German aircraft weaknesses. The document's tone was dry, but between the lines lay the thrill of discovery. Britain had found the crack in the enemy's armor. One evening, Briggs visited the hangar long after dark. His Spitfire sat under dim lamps, wings scarred, skin patched with silver tape. A mechanic looked up and said quietly, "She'll be ready by dawn." Briggs nodded, resting a hand on the cool metal. The machine felt alive, breathing faintly through the cooling vents. He thought of the German pilots, men like him, bound by duty and arrogance, believing that speed could outrun fate. But speed, he now knew, was only half the story. War belonged to those who could turn, adapt, and survive. Over Calais, Keller sat in his bunk, cigarette trembling between his fingers. Outside, the wind carried the smell of sea and oil. He opened his logbook, stared at the blank page, and wrote, "Spitfire, superior in turns, especially low altitude. Avoid dogfight." Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "Our speed no longer saves us." By late August, that truth reached Berlin. High Command sent new orders to all fighter units. Do not engage Spitfires in turning combat. Strike and climb away immediately. The order carried the weight of silent panic. But for the men who faced each other over the channel, no command could erase instinct. Once locked in the dance, the difference between life and death was measured not in miles per hour, but in the arc of a wingtip and the courage to stay in the circle one heartbeat longer. The sky over Dover, once a proving ground for speed, had become something else, a mirror reflecting the change of an entire war. The hunters were learning that victory was not about running faster, but about who could stay inside the storm and still find grace within it. By early September, the British had turned survival into science. What began as desperation had evolved into design, a strategy born in the narrow skies over Kent, where every mile of airspace was measured in smoke and loss. The Spitfire squadrons, battered but unbroken, now fought not to match the German speed, but to manipulate it. The plan was whispered through briefings and radio rooms, passed from squadron to squadron like a secret code. It was simple, dangerous, and brilliant. Make them turn. Draw the Messerschmitts into circles they couldn't escape. It went against every instinct of the German doctrine, against the mantra that had defined the Luftwaffe's rise: speed, climb, dive, disengage. But instincts are hard to silence, especially in the heat of combat, when pride overrules reason and a flash of silver in the clouds feels like a challenge that must be answered. At Biggin Hill, Squadron Leader Parker explained it to his men with the calm of a teacher outlining geometry. "They come fast. They shoot. They try to climb out. Don't chase. Make them bleed their speed. Once they bank, they're yours. The Spitfire's wing will hold the turn. Theirs won't." Alan Briggs sat in the front row, scribbling notes, though he already knew the rhythm by heart. He could picture it. The dive, the overshoot, the split second when the Messerschmitt tried to climb but lost the angle. The trap wasn't just mechanical. It was psychological. You had to let the enemy believe he was winning. Only when he tried to finish the kill did you close the circle. That afternoon, clouds rolled in from the channel, heavy and low. Radar screens lit up. Raid approaching, 40 plus. The order came through. Scramble. The pilots sprinted for their planes, boots slipping on wet grass, engines roaring to life in a chorus that shook the hangars. Within minutes, 12 Spitfires climbed into the gray sky, vanishing into the mist. The Germans came in formation, bombers at the center, Messerschmitts wheeling above like hawks. Among them was Keller, his face pale from lack of sleep. The last week had stolen his confidence. Each sortie ended with fewer men returning. The Spitfires were ghosts, slower on paper, yet always appearing where he least expected them. At 20,000 feet, the clouds broke open. Keller spotted the British flight, tight, disciplined, turning toward the bombers. He gave the signal. The Messerschmitts dove. Speed howled through the airframe. Tracers flashed. One Spitfire disintegrated in fire, the pilot vanishing in a streak of smoke. For a moment, it felt like France again. Clean, efficient, victory measured in seconds. Then the Spitfires rolled. Two slipped behind the German formation in one fluid movement, looping under the bombers, coming up from below. Keller banked hard, trying to cut across, but the Spitfires had already begun the circle, smooth, patient, deliberate. The Germans followed, compelled by instinct, and the trap snapped shut. Inside the turn, the Spitfires felt weightless, their wings biting perfectly into the air. Outside, the Messerschmitts fought their own physics, bleeding speed, slats snapping open, engines straining. One German pulled too tight. His plane stalled, flipping nose over tail into the clouds. Another tried to climb, but a burst from Briggs's guns caught him square in the fuselage. The 109 spun downward, trailing black smoke into the sea. "Stay in the circle," Parker's voice came through the radio. "Make them turn. Keep them turning." Briggs gritted his teeth, the G-forces pressing his body into the seat. Sweat filled his eyes, but he held the line, keeping the Spitfire's nose steady through the arc. Ahead of him, the German pilot tried again to break free. Briggs saw the flash of sunlight off the canopy, aimed, fired a short burst. The Messerschmitt shuddered, then fell away. Below, the bombers scattered. Deprived of their escorts, they jettisoned their payloads early, their bombs falling harmlessly into the channel. The German formation dissolved. What began as an attack became retreat. The Spitfires pursued only far enough to ensure the sky was clear, then turned home. When Briggs landed, the airfield was silent except for the ticking of cooling engines. Mechanics ran toward the returning fighters, counting them, scanning the horizon for stragglers. 3 had not returned, but 7 Messerschmitts were confirmed down. Parker met Briggs on the tarmac, rain dripping from his cap. "It worked," he said quietly. "They can't resist the chase. It's in their blood." Briggs nodded, too tired to smile. "They think we're prey," he said. "They don't see the trap until it's too late." Across the channel, Keller wrote his report with mechanical precision. Losses: 3 aircraft. Cause: low-speed engagement, excessive turning. Recommendation: avoid prolonged maneuvering with Spitfire units. His pen paused over the page. He wanted to write more, to confess the truth that every pilot now whispered. The British had changed the rules of the sky, but officers were not supposed to write about doubt. That night, the Luftwaffe command issued a new directive. Engagements with Spitfires must be vertical. Dive, strike, climb, disengage. Do not enter turning combat. It was a technical order masking a moral wound. At Biggin Hill, Briggs sat with his squadron in the dim light of the mess hall. The air smelled of tea, tobacco, and wet wool. On the radio, a soft voice read the names of missing pilots. No one spoke for a long time. Then someone murmured, "They'll come again tomorrow." Briggs looked toward the dark window. Beyond it, the storm clouds gathered over the channel, lit occasionally by distant flashes of lightning. "Let them come," he said. "We'll teach them to dance." Outside, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, washing the oil and powder from the wings of the waiting Spitfires. And above the cliffs of Dover, unseen in the darkness, the wind carried the scent of salt and smoke, as if the sea itself was holding its breath for the next day's battle. Dawn broke like a faded photograph, gray light over the channel, a horizon smudged by mist. The air smelled of rain and exhaust. The Battle of Britain had entered its cruel rhythm. Scramble, climb, fight, count the missing. Yet amid the chaos, the air war had become something deeply personal, a contest not just of machines, but of men. By mid-September, the RAF and Luftwaffe had both begun to revolve around a handful of names. Keller's squadron, based near Calais, was known to British intelligence. His call sign, Yellow One, appeared often in decoded radio intercepts. On the English side, Alan Briggs's unit, part of 92 Squadron, had earned the grim nickname the Circle Makers among German pilots. Their reputation was spreading faster than their numbers could replenish. That morning, both men rose before dawn, separated by a sea narrow enough to cross in 10 minutes, yet divided by everything else. Keller shaved in silence, the rasp of the blade echoing in the cold barracks. He hadn't slept. Each night he dreamed of the sky, the dizzying turns, the endless spinning horizon, the smell of hot oil and burning canvas. In his logbook, a single sentence from yesterday's debrief stared back at him. Avoid turning combat. He underlined it twice, though he already knew it was useless advice. Once you saw the Spitfire banking in front of you, the instinct to follow was overwhelming. Across the water, Briggs sat in the mess hall, coffee untouched, scanning the morning reports. Weather: broken clouds at 15,000 feet. Enemy activity? Likely. He stretched his aching arms and stared out the window at his Spitfire, patched, scarred, and yet somehow more alive than ever. He knew the Germans would come. They always came. The scramble order arrived at 0742. Within 5 minutes, the engines were screaming, the ground shrinking into a blur of fields and smoke. Briggs's flight climbed through a thin layer of cloud, bursting into sunlight at 20,000 feet. Below them, the channel shimmered like molten steel. The intercept came swiftly. Bandits, 12 o'clock. High. Briggs heard Parker's voice, calm but taut. Distant shapes approached from the east. A dozen Messerschmitts, their wings catching the sun like knives. The two formations met head-on, guns blazing. The air filled with the glitter of tracers and the deep metallic howl of engines straining at the edge of performance. Briggs rolled left, dove, then pulled into a climbing spiral. One of the Germans followed. He caught a glimpse of black crosses and yellow nose. Keller's plane. For a moment, the rest of the battle disappeared. The sky narrowed to two aircraft locked in motion, tracing arcs invisible to anyone below. Keller fired, short controlled bursts that ripped through empty air as Briggs rolled again, the Spitfire twisting impossibly tight. Keller followed, faster, steeper, until the G-force blurred his vision. Both men knew the stakes. It was no longer about tactics or doctrine. It was about pride. Each represented the myth of his nation, one built on discipline and engineering, the other on instinct and resilience. Briggs pulled the Spitfire into a full circle, feeling the airframe groan in protest. The plane vibrated, but held. Keller's Messerschmitt swung wide, struggling to keep up. Every time he tried to tighten the turn, the slat snapped open and the aircraft shuddered. "Stay calm," Keller muttered to himself. "Wait for the mistake." But Briggs made none. He eased off the throttle slightly, forcing the Spitfire to pivot just a fraction tighter. The two fighters completed another circle, then another. Keller's engine began to cough under the strain. His speed, once his advantage, now betrayed him. On the ground below, farmers looked up from their fields to see two silver specks carving spirals through the blue. They watched, spellbound, as the contrails twisted and merged, one tighter than the other, until one line broke away in smoke. In the cockpit, Keller's warning light flashed red, oil pressure falling. He risked a glance backward. The Spitfire was closing, its elliptical wings gleaming like a predator's grin. He banked sharply, diving toward the channel. Briggs followed. The wind roared, the altimeter spun. Both men hurtled downward at terrifying speed. Keller leveled out just above the water, spray flicking against his canopy. The Spitfire overshot by inches, pulling up at the last second. Keller seized the moment, rolled, and climbed, firing as he rose. Bullets tore through Briggs's right wing. Smoke poured from the Spitfire, but Briggs held control. He looped, dove again, forcing Keller to follow. The duel became a mirror of motion, each anticipating the other, each refusing to break away. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Keller's ammunition counter ticked toward zero. Briggs's fuel warning light blinked, yet neither turned for home. In war, moments like these were not about orders or nations. They were about the refusal to yield. At last, fate intervened. Keller's engine sputtered, coughing black smoke. He pulled back the throttle, tried to climb, but the Messerschmitt stalled. For a breathless instant, the aircraft hung motionless against the sky, then dropped. Briggs watched it fall, spiraling down toward the sea. He followed with his eyes until it vanished into the haze. No parachute, no signal, just silence. Back at Biggin Hill, he landed with fuel barely left. The mechanics waved, shouting something he couldn't hear. His hand shook as he unstrapped himself. The world on the ground felt unreal, too still after the chaos above. That night, he sat alone outside the barracks, watching the faint light from the coast across the water. Somewhere out there, Keller's name would be marked in a report as missing. Briggs knew what that meant. He also knew the next Keller would come, as they always did. He took a deep breath and looked up. The sky was clear, the stars cold and distant. In their quiet perfection, he saw the truth both sides had learned. Technology could win seconds, but willpower decided minutes. And in those minutes, wars were turned. The air war over England was no longer about conquest. It had become a test of endurance, a duel of wills written in vapor trails and silence. And as autumn crept in over the channel, both nations understood that whoever mastered patience, not speed, would own the sky. By October 1940, the Battle of Britain had transformed from a campaign into endurance itself. The sky was no longer blue. It was gray, stained by months of smoke and contrails. Engines coughed in the hangars before dawn, and pilots climbed into cockpits already slick with oil and fear. Victory and loss had become indistinguishable. The only measure that mattered was who returned. For those who fought, the cockpit had ceased to be a machine. It was a second skin, cramped, vibrating, alive with noise and heat. It was the last small world left to a man once he lifted from the ground. Alan Briggs sat inside his Spitfire, sealed in the thin shell of glass and steel. Around him, the instrument panel glowed faintly green. Altimeter, airspeed, oil pressure, fuel. The dials trembled, alive with their own pulse. Beyond the canopy stretched the pale dawn sky, the horizon a faint scar between land and sea. He could smell everything. The hot tang of fuel, the leather of his gloves, the metallic sting of oxygen. When the engine came to life, it wasn't just sound. It was a vibration through his chest, a reminder that his heart and the Merlin engine beat in the same rhythm. He checked his gun sight, flexed his fingers on the stick, and waited for the signal. The radio crackled with voices, some calm, some half mad with fatigue. Red section, ready for takeoff. Copy that, Red. Angels 15, raid incoming. Godspeed. The wheels lifted, and gravity let go. For the next hour, his entire existence was a confined choreography of reflex and instinct. Every control movement was deliberate, every mistake fatal. The Spitfire climbed smoothly, her wings slicing through cloud layers like silk. Briggs adjusted the mixture, leveled off at 15,000 feet. His eyes scanned the horizon, never resting. He knew that death, when it came, would come from behind. Somewhere above, German formations were climbing too. Inside their cockpits, the world felt utterly different, yet strangely familiar. Oberfeldwebel Martin Kohler, Keller's replacement, sat hunched inside his Messerschmitt Bf 109. The cockpit was narrow, almost claustrophobic, framed by thick armor glass. Every surface seemed designed for function, not comfort, efficient but unkind. He felt the heat building around his legs, the engine's hum vibrating through the seat. He could see only forward and slightly to the sides. Behind him, the world was invisible, a blind spot every German pilot feared. They called it der tote Winkel, the dead angle. Many had died because of it. Still, the 109 had its own language, and Kohler understood it. The throttle's weight, the stick's resistance, the subtle shudder before a stall. All these were cues as intimate as breath. He rolled his shoulders, settled deeper into the seat, and waited for the signal. When contact came, it was sudden and merciless. Bandits! 12 o'clock high! The formations collided over the Kent coastline. The sky turned to chaos. Inside the cockpit, time broke apart. There was no horizon, no ground, only movement, sound, and survival. Briggs threw the Spitfire into a roll, bullets tearing past. His ears rang from the roar of engines, the rattle of gunfire. He caught a glimpse of a Messerschmitt diving past his nose, yellow nose, black cross, and instinct pulled the stick left. The G-force slammed him into the seat. The oxygen mask bit into his face. He felt the blood drain from his eyes, the edges of his vision darkening. The Spitfire groaned, but held the turn. He fired once, short burst. Tracers arced across the air, missing by inches. Brake, Red 2! Brake! The radio screamed. He rolled again, climbing into a tight spiral. Below him, a German fighter burst into flame. No parachute. He didn't know who fired the shot, and it didn't matter. Victories in the sky were anonymous. Names were written only in loss. In his Messerschmitt, Kohler's breath came short. The canopy fogged around the edges. He pulled into a dive to escape, but the Spitfire behind him matched every move, closing the circle tighter. He tried to roll inverted. The control stick trembled. The slats snapped open. A split second later, he felt the shuddering that every German pilot dreaded. Stall. He leveled out, barely, and climbed again. The channel flashed below, silver and cold. His hands were slick with sweat. He looked down at the gauges, fuel low, ammo nearly gone. Verdammt, he hissed, slamming the throttle forward. Briggs saw him break away and gave chase. The two aircraft streaked through the clouds, diving and climbing in desperate rhythm. Kohler's radio crackled with static. He could hear his wingman shouting, but the words were lost in the roar. He looked back and saw nothing but sunlight. The Spitfire appeared from nowhere. Two short bursts. Smoke poured from the Messerschmitt's nose. Kohler bailed out at the last moment, his parachute blooming like a white scar across the blue. When Briggs landed at Biggin Hill that afternoon, the airfield was half empty. Half the squadron was gone or damaged beyond repair. Mechanics moved silently between wrecks, their faces gray with exhaustion. He climbed out of the cockpit, every muscle trembling. The mechanic handed him a cup of tea that shook in his hand. Briggs stared at the rising steam, unable to taste it. The world seemed muted, the colors too soft, the air too still. He walked back to his Spitfire, resting his hand on the bullet holes along her fuselage. You did well, girl, he whispered. The plane smelled of smoke and victory and death. That night, as rain tapped softly against the barrack windows, Briggs wrote a single line in his logbook. Inside the cockpit, there is no heroism, only endurance. Across the channel, in a hospital near Calais, Kohler lay staring at the ceiling. His hands were bandaged, his leg broken. The nurses moved quietly around him. On the table beside his bed lay a charred fragment of aluminum, part of his Messerschmitt skin. Someone had salvaged it from the wreck. He turned it over in his hand, tracing the blackened edge with his thumb. He closed his eyes and whispered the name of the plane that had brought him down, not in hatred, but in reluctant respect. Spitfire. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The sea, restless as ever, whispered between them both, the sound of engines still echoing over the channel, where men in steel birds continued to carve their stories into the sky. By November, the light over England had changed. The mornings came slower, shrouded in fog that clung to the airfields like memory. The war had entered its lean, hungry phase. The Luftwaffe still struck, but not with the fury of summer. Their attacks came in fractured waves, testing, probing, retreating. The German pilots called it der Winternebel, the winter fog of defeat. The British simply called it survival. For Alan Briggs and his squadron, days blurred together. Scramble, fight, land, count. The rhythm was mechanical, almost ritualistic. The war had reduced itself to reflex, but the fear, that remained. Not the sharp panic of first battle, but a deeper, quieter fear. The kind that followed you into dreams, into the sound of engines, even when the sky was empty. Each morning, the pilots gathered in the briefing room, faces pale in the dim light. Maps spread across the wall like open wounds. Red arrows, blue markers, the shifting front of a war, fought above their own roofs. They no longer looked for strategy. They looked for patterns in the chaos, where the enemy would strike next, where the next empty seat in the mess would be. That day began like so many others. Cold wind off the channel, the smell of damp grass, the faint tang of fuel already in the air. Briggs strapped into his Spitfire, fingers numbed through the gloves. The mechanic gave him a thumbs up, and the engine roared to life. Another sortie, another gamble with the sky. The call came moments later. Raid approaching Dover, 20 plus, altitude 15,000. The squadron climbed through low cloud, the world below dissolving into gray. At 20,000 feet, sunlight burst through, blinding, pure. Ahead, black specks grew into shapes, bombers, flanked by Messerschmitts. The trap of summer was gone now. The Germans had learned. They no longer lingered in turning fights. They dove, struck fast, vanished before the British could circle. But this time, something was different. As Briggs's flight closed in, the German formation broke early. The bombers turned back, leaving the fighters alone. It was a lure, a test, a new tactic perhaps. The British hesitated for only a second, then pressed on. The air exploded in motion. Spitfires and Messerschmitts tangled in the sunlight, looping, diving, bursting through clouds like ghosts. Briggs saw one German flash past his wingtip, close enough to see the pilot's goggles, his face taut with focus. He rolled hard, followed the movement, pressed the trigger. Nothing. Jammed. He swore, pulled the stick back, climbed through the cloud. "Red one! You're 6!" came the warning. He rolled left just in time. Tracers sliced through the space he'd occupied seconds earlier. The Messerschmitt behind him was relentless. Briggs pulled tighter, feeling the aircraft strain, his body crushed by G-forces. His vision darkened, his lungs screamed for air. The Spitfire groaned, its wings flexing dangerously, but it held. The German pressed the advantage, cutting the circle, waiting for the British plane to falter. But Briggs did not. He eased off slightly, then kicked the rudder. A sudden skid that threw his pursuer offline. The Spitfire rolled over and came around. Now he was behind the Messerschmitt. "Got you," he whispered. He squeezed the trigger. This time, the guns answered. Short, bright bursts. Tracers walked across the enemy's fuselage. Smoke erupted from the 109's engine. It spiraled down, black and silver, disappearing into the sea mist below. For a long moment, the sky was empty. Briggs leveled out, heart hammering. Sweat soaked his flight suit. The radio crackled. Broken voices, half static. Some calling for bearings, others silent. "Red 1 to base, returning low on fuel," he said, voice hoarse. He turned west toward the coast. Below, the white cliffs glowed through the haze, the one constant in a war that had erased everything else. Back at Biggin Hill, the airfield looked half deserted. Only a few aircraft had returned. The others, gone. He landed, taxied to the dispersal area, and sat there with the engine idling until a mechanic tapped his canopy. "Sir, you can shut her down,"